It was a cold, crisp morning in late February when David Harrison vanished without a trace. The air in the small town of Greenfield, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, was still with the weight of the unexplained. For over 2 weeks, there had been no sign of David, no calls, no messages. His car, a sleek silver sedan, was found parked in front of his mother's lake house on the outskirts of town, but he was gone. His phone was left behind on the kitchen counter screen, cracked with a note scrawled in a hasty hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't explain. I'll be back soon." But David never returned. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the sudden disappearance of the heir to one of the town's oldest families was more than unsettling. David had been a successful businessman, but to his aging mother Margaret, he was her only son, her only connection to the past. The fear she felt in the first few hours after David disappeared turned into an anxious dread when the police found no trace of him, and no one could explain why he would leave everything behind without a word. What had started as a normal February morning soon spiraled into a mystery that would shake the town of Greenfield to its core. Greenfield was a town that seemed to exist in the past. Its streets were lined with Victorian houses, their facades worn by time, but full of character, much like the people who lived in them. The town was small, just under 10,000 people, so secrets were hard to keep. The courthouse was a stately building at the town's center, and the few shops on Main Street closed early, their wooden shutters creaking as the sun set behind the hills. It had been a month since the cold wind of Thanksgiving had turned into a bitter winter for Margaret Harrison. The loss of her son's trust, her years of struggle to rebuild, after being defrauded by her former daughter-in-law Victoria, felt like it had set a shadow over her life. But nothing had prepared her for the call she received from the Greenfield Police Department that morning. Margaret Officer Rick Collins had said, his voice strained, "I need you to come down to the station. It's about David." It was Thursday, February 19th, a gray morning with clouds that hung low over the lake like a heavy blanket. Margaret had gone out for her usual walk along the shore before sunrise. When she returned to the lake house, David's silver sedan was parked where it always was, a few feet away from the porch. But when she entered the house, she was met with silence, an eerie silence that felt out of place. The phone call from the police came shortly after breakfast. The police report was clear. David's disappearance was sudden, with no indication that he was planning to leave. He hadn't contacted anyone in the days leading up to his disappearance, which was unlike him. No one had seen him leave his mother's house, and his car had not been spotted in any other part of town. What the police did find was unsettling. David's phone, a top-of-the-line model, had been left on the kitchen counter, cracked, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. Beside it was a small piece of paper with his handwriting. The note read, "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't explain. I'll be back soon." The words were brief, but it was the phrase, "I'll be back soon," that stuck in Margaret's mind. The police had scoured the house, the yard, even the nearby woods. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. It was as though David had simply vanished. But what troubled Margaret the most was the smell of burned paper she noticed as she entered the kitchen. Her first thought was that the house had caught fire, but the smoke detectors hadn't gone off, and there was no trace of a blaze. Upon closer inspection, she found a few charred fragments of what appeared to be a document tucked underneath the countertop. It was the last thing David had been working on, but she couldn't make out the details. Greenfield was a small town with a few police officers who mostly dealt with traffic violations, petty thefts, and the occasional family dispute. A missing person case like David's was outside their usual scope, and so the state police were called in to assist. At first they suspected a simple case of a young man needing space. David had been under stress for months. His mother had recently been in the news for her role in exposing a complex financial fraud scheme, one orchestrated by his now ex-wife Victoria. But Margaret had trouble believing that her son would leave without saying goodbye, especially after everything they had been through together. The investigators soon uncovered a troubling detail. In the days before his disappearance, David had been acting strangely. He had met with several people from his past people Margaret had never heard of. Private investigators, financial advisors, and lawyers, people who were supposedly trying to help him untangle the complex mess Victoria had left behind. But David had also been doing something else. He'd been looking into the disappearances of other people in the area over the last few years. Several people had gone missing from Greenfield in the last 2 decades, though none of the cases had been solved. Most were brushed off as simple runaway cases or people getting lost in the woods. But David had been researching those, delving into old newspaper articles and court records, connecting dots no one else had thought to connect. What the police didn't know, what Margaret didn't even know, was that David had stumbled onto something far bigger than a few local disappearances. Over the last year, he had been investigating Victoria's connection to organized crime, something that had only started to surface in the wake of her financial fraud trial. Victoria David's ex-wife had always been a mystery to Margaret. She had charmed her way into their family, and for years no one had suspected the woman was living a double life. But after the fraud trial, secrets began to unravel. Documents hidden in Victoria's accounts, strange meetings with people who didn't seem to fit into her social circle. It turned out that she had ties to a much darker underworld, a group involved in financial fraud, money laundering, and possibly human trafficking. David had started putting the pieces together, and Margaret believed that the closer he got to uncovering the truth, the more dangerous it became. The first theory. At first, the investigators considered the possibility that David's disappearance was somehow related to his ex-wife Victoria. After all, her family had lost everything in the aftermath of the fraud, and there were rumors circulating about her involvement in other more illicit activities. Some even whispered that Victoria had orchestrated a network of people disappearing to cover up her tracks, but there was no concrete evidence to prove it. The theory that David's disappearance might be linked to something more sinister than a mere personal crisis began to gain traction when the police found phone records indicating that David had received several calls from a mysterious number the night before he vanished. The number was unlisted, and there was no way to trace it back to anyone in Greenfield. But the most disturbing clue was found when police searched David's house, a manila envelope hidden in the back of his closet. Inside was a list of names, dozens of them spanning back over the last decade. All were people who had disappeared without a trace, just like David. The list seemed too deliberate to be a coincidence. Margaret realized with growing dread that her son had uncovered something much larger than a simple family betrayal. David's investigation had led him into the crosshairs of a dangerous network that had been operating under the radar for years, targeting wealthy families like hers. As the investigation unfolded, the truth seemed to slip further and further away. David was missing, and no one could explain why or where he had gone. The only thing that was clear was that he had uncovered something that could cost him his life. Margaret, in her desperate need for answers, began to connect the dots between her own family's tragic history and the mysterious disappearances in Greenfield. David Harrison was gone, and whoever had taken him was not just after his disappearance, they were after everything he had discovered. The next chapter of this story would be darker and much more dangerous, but for now, the only thing Margaret could do was wait for the truth, and hope that somehow she could find her son before it was too late. The days that followed David Harrison's disappearance were a blur for Margaret. Every moment felt like a waiting game, an interminable stretch of time where the unanswered questions weighed on her like an invisible burden. The small town of Greenfield, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a cage. Every street corner, every quiet road by the lake, each held a piece of the puzzle, yet no one had answers. By February 24th, 5 days had passed since David vanished. Margaret's house, once a refuge from the world's chaos, felt cold. The warmth of her son's visits, his laughter at breakfast, had all faded away, replaced by a stillness that gnawed at her soul. The police had done their part scouring the lake house, combing through the surrounding woods, even questioning local residents. But there had been no breakthrough. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. The missing note, the one David had left behind, weighed heavily on her mind. "I'll be back soon." She could hardly believe those words anymore, not when every day that passed felt like another shred of hope slipping away. Her first real lead came when she received a phone call from Officer Collins. He had information that might explain her son's actions, though it came with its own set of disturbing questions. The police had been able to trace the mysterious phone calls David had received in the days before he disappeared. The number, unlisted and foreign to the area, had been registered to a burner phone. The calls themselves had been short and cryptic, but one detail stood out. David had received several calls between midnight and 2 a.m. on the night before he vanished. It didn't make sense. David had always been a creature of habit, often in bed by 10 o'clock. What could have possibly been so urgent that he'd taken calls at such an odd hour? Officer Collins had suggested a few theories. It was possible that David had been trying to track down the connections he'd uncovered during his investigation into Victoria's fraud. But why the secrecy? Why the hidden number? The officer had no answers, only a growing pile of questions. Margaret's thoughts turned to the list of missing people that David had been compiling. "Had he uncovered something that someone didn't want him to find? I've arranged for you to speak with someone." Collins told her, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to meet. There's a connection between David and some of these disappearances, something bigger than we thought." Margaret agreed, her heart sinking as she prepared herself for the possibility of her worst fears becoming a reality. The following morning, Margaret met with a private investigator hired by the police department, a man named William Hart, an experienced former FBI agent with a reputation for solving cold cases. He'd been briefed on David's case, and he wasted no time in cutting to the chase. "I think your son was onto something." Mrs. Harrison Hart began, leaning across the table, his expression grave. "Something connected to Victoria. But it's not just her. This goes deeper. The disappearances of people over the years are linked to people with money, people who have something to lose, people like David." Margaret listened, her throat tightening. She had always suspected that Victoria's world, the world David had once been a part of, was full of shadows. But this was more than just a web of deceit. "Do you know who else was on David's list?" Hart asked, pulling a folder from his briefcase. The names he was researching, they're all connected to one thing, the Larkspur Foundation. Margaret's heart skipped. She'd heard of the Larkspur Foundation. It was a well-known philanthropic organization with deep ties to New York's wealthiest families. They funded everything from scholarships to medical research, all in the name of charitable giving. On the surface, it was the epitome of a good cause. But William Hart was telling a different story. "The Larkspur Foundation isn't what it appears," Hart continued. "It's a front. Behind the charitable donations, they're involved in something much darker: money laundering, human trafficking, illegal arms dealing. And we believe that David stumbled onto this operation when he started digging into Victoria's past." The idea that Victoria's family might have been involved in something so nefarious was hard to process, but everything Hart said started to fit. Victoria's secretive behavior, her wealth. Despite her modest background, her manipulations of David, they all pointed to something much larger than her just being a fraudster. Hart outlined a chilling possibility. David had been getting close to uncovering the true nature of the Larkspur Foundation's operations. The Foundation's financial records were kept under tight wraps, but several missing individuals whose disappearances had been linked to the town had worked with or been associated with people connected to Larkspur. The Foundation's donors and its directors, many of them have ties to unsolved disappearances. Wealthy individuals whose children, spouses, or business partners just vanished, Hart explained. "The evidence is there, Mrs. Harrison, but it's carefully hidden. I believe your son had found something that could bring it all crashing down." The names on David's list weren't just coincidences. They were part of a much larger coordinated effort to cover up a network of crime. And David's investigation had been close to exposing it all. "What happened the night before he disappeared?" Hart asked. The phone calls, the frantic search through his files, it doesn't add up. I believe someone is protecting their interests, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep this quiet. Margaret's thoughts were racing. She realized then that David's investigation had made him a target. He had been dangerously close to exposing a powerful organization that was involved in crimes far beyond fraud. With William Hart's help, Margaret began to unravel more pieces of the puzzle. They discovered that David had been receiving threatening messages, some veiled as warnings from anonymous sources urging him to stop looking into the Larkspur Foundation. They also found evidence that David had been surveilled for weeks before he vanished. Someone was watching him, someone who didn't want the truth to be known. But there was still no sign of David. The police followed the trail as best as they could, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. Margaret found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid that the people responsible for David's disappearance were closer than she realized. The realization that her son might have been silenced for the sake of a dangerous secret turned her stomach. By March 1st, the police had uncovered something even more disturbing, a series of documents hidden deep within the archives of the Larkspur Foundation, documents that linked high-ranking members of the organization to an underground syndicate. This syndicate wasn't just involved in organized crime, it was responsible for running secretive high-stakes auctions, dealing in stolen art, weapons, and even people. David's disappearance wasn't just a random act, it was a message. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure he didn't expose the organization's activities. As the investigation into the Larkspur Foundation deepened, Margaret began to consider the possibility that David's investigation had gone too far too quickly. Had he gotten in over his head? Was there a chance that David had made a dangerous deal, one that he could no longer back out of? The further Margaret dug into her son's final days, the clearer it became. David hadn't disappeared of his own accord. He had been taken silence by someone with far more power than her son had ever realized. But who and why was it so important to stop him? With each new discovery, Margaret's resolve hardened. The answers she was looking for weren't going to come easily. But if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that David was still out there somewhere. He had to be. And she would stop at nothing to find him, no matter where the trail led. As Margaret stared out across the lake that had once been a sanctuary, she realized the quiet, peaceful life she had known was gone. The world she had once believed to be safe had crumbled, and the truth about her son's disappearance was becoming more terrifying with every passing day. The Larkspur Foundation, once just a name on a donor list, had become the key to understanding the labyrinth of lies and danger that surrounded her family. And as the stakes grew higher, so did the urgency of Margaret's quest for the truth. But no one knew how far the shadows of the past stretched, and how deeply they would go to bury the secrets that David had uncovered. By the first week of March, the investigation into David's disappearance had reached a critical juncture. Margaret and William Hart had uncovered several key pieces of evidence, linking the Larkspur Foundation to illegal activities far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. But with every discovery, the stakes grew higher. It was during one of these pivotal moments that Margaret's life would take another shocking turn. Late one night, just as the clock struck 10:30 p.m., Margaret was startled by a knock at her door. She hadn't been expecting anyone, least of all at such a late hour. She opened the door cautiously, only to find a man standing in the shadows. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a cap, but his eyes, sharp and piercing, gave him away. "Mrs. Harrison." His voice was low-controlled. "I need to talk to you." Margaret's heart skipped. She recognized him immediately. This was the same man she had seen in a grainy photograph during her research, the man who had been involved with Larkspur's more illicit operations. But how did he know where she lived? More importantly, what did he want? He stepped forward, leaning in close enough for her to smell the faint hint of tobacco on his breath. "I know what you're looking for. You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not afraid of you," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She had no idea who this man was, or what he was capable of, But one thing was clear, he wasn't here to help. The man studied her for a moment, sizing her up. "You should be," he said coldly. "You think you're close, don't you? But you're not. You'll never find your son if you keep digging. You'll only end up like the others." Margaret's pulse quickened. "The others?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "People who thought they could expose the truth about Larkspur. People who wanted to stand in the way of something much bigger than them. You're already in too deep. There's no turning back." Before Margaret could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving her standing frozen in the doorway. Her mind raced as she processed the chilling warning. It was clear now David hadn't just stumbled onto a random conspiracy. He had uncovered something far more dangerous, and there were people willing to do anything to silence him. The encounter had shaken Margaret to her core, but it also gave her the clarity she needed. The Larkspur Foundation was not just an innocent charity. It was a web of corruption, and her son had been caught in the middle. She had already known this on some level, but hearing it from someone involved with the foundation confirmed the stakes. David had been in the crosshairs of something massive. The following day, Margaret met with William Hart again. She was determined to get to the bottom of this no matter what. "I had a visitor last night," she told him, her voice steady, but her hands shaking as she clutched the edge of the table. "A man from the Larkspur Foundation. He warned me to stop digging. He said people like me never find the truth." Hart's expression grew more serious. "It's exactly what I feared. We're on the edge of something dangerous, Margaret. They don't want us anywhere near the truth, but we're too close to turn back now." She nodded grimly. "I won't stop. David is out there, and I know he's alive. I'll do whatever it takes to find him." Hart's eyes softened for a moment. "I believe you, but we need to be careful. Larkspur has too much power, and they don't hesitate to protect their interests. They're involved in some very high-level operations. If David found something that connects them to criminal activity, then it's not just his life that's at risk, it's yours too." Margaret took a deep breath. She had already known the danger, but hearing it from Hart made it all the more real. There was no turning back. She had come too far, and she was unwilling to let her son's disappearance be swept under the rug. They needed to act fast. Over the next few days, Margaret and Hart worked tirelessly to comb through the new evidence they had obtained. They uncovered a disturbing piece of information that seemed to confirm everything they had feared. David had been in contact with someone from the inside of the Larkspur Foundation just days before his disappearance. The contact was a woman named Lily Grayson, a former employee of Larkspur who had been fired under mysterious circumstances. Lily had once been a high-ranking member of the Foundation's financial team before she disappeared from the public eye. According to the records Hart had found, Lily had been in constant communication with David during the weeks leading up to his disappearance. It was clear that David had been trying to arrange a meeting with her, likely to get her to testify against Larkspur. Hart immediately made contact with Lily's last known address. When he returned to Margaret with the news, his face was pale. "Lily Grayson is gone. Her apartment's been cleaned out. She's disappeared, just like David." Margaret's heart sank. "Do you think she's dead? I can't say for sure, but we need to act fast. Larkspur doesn't take kindly to whistleblowers. If Lily had valuable information, they wouldn't hesitate to silence her." Margaret's mind raced. Was Lily dead? Was she in hiding? And what about David? If Lily knew anything, it was likely David had been trying to get to her. If she was gone, Margaret forced herself to focus. She needed to stay calm and think clearly. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice tight with determination. Hart didn't hesitate. "We go to the Foundation's headquarters. We find out who's behind all of this and make sure your son's name isn't forgotten." The plan was simple yet dangerous. William Hart would infiltrate the Larkspur Foundation's headquarters and attempt to retrieve whatever documents he could that could expose the organization's criminal operations. Meanwhile, Margaret would continue to search for more leads on David's whereabouts, trying to put together the pieces that would lead her to him. But as they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, Margaret realized that they were no longer just fighting for the truth. They were fighting for their lives. The stakes had never been higher. They were facing an organization with vast resources, powerful allies, and a history of silencing anyone who threatened to expose them. Margaret was scared, but she had never been more determined. "Whatever happens, I'm not stopping," she whispered to herself, as she stared out at the darkened sky, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't going to lose her son. Not now, not after everything they had uncovered. As the night stretched on, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning. They were closing in on something bigger than either of them had anticipated, a conspiracy that spanned years, with fingers in every aspect of the criminal world. But the truth was out there, and she would stop at nothing to uncover it. Her son's life depended on it. The tension in the air was palpable as William Hart and Margaret prepared for the most dangerous phase of their investigation. With Lily Grayson gone and David's trail growing colder by the hour, they had no choice but to take a bold risk. If they wanted to get to the bottom of the Larkspur Foundation's dark secrets, they had to go straight to the heart of the organization, its headquarters. Located in a sleek, modern building near the financial district of Seattle, the Foundation's headquarters was a fortress of corporate secrecy. Security was tight, and the staff was well trained in keeping outsiders at bay. But Margaret and William had one advantage: they knew someone inside who was willing to help. Lily Grayson, in her final messages to David, had dropped subtle hints about a security breach in the Foundation's archives, a weakness in their system that could allow access to their most classified files. The Foundation had kept everything under lock and key, but now it seemed there was a way in. Under the cover of night, Margaret and William set their plan into motion. They parked a few blocks away from the Foundation's headquarters, blending in with the shadows, as they made their way toward the back entrance. William carried a small bag filled with tools, while Margaret's hands trembled with a mix of fear and anticipation. "I'm not going to lie," William said, glancing around nervously. "This is a bad idea, Margaret. But it's the only shot we have." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "But we can't back down now. Not after everything we've uncovered." They reached the back door, and William got to work with his lock-picking tools. It took only a few minutes before the door clicked open. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as they slipped inside, the faint hum of the building's security system echoing in the background. The interior was cold and sterile, the hallway lined with offices and glass doors. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way toward the basement level, where the archives were rumored to be stored. The security cameras above them blinked in the dim light, and every step felt like it might be their last. Down in the archives, they found what they were looking for. The room was lined with shelves of confidential files, old records, and documents that seemed to stretch on for miles. Margaret's breath caught as she scanned the room, aware that this was the motherlode evidence of the Foundation's true operations. William immediately set to work, pulling files off the shelves and flipping through them with practiced efficiency. They were looking for anything that might connect Larkspur to illegal activities. Within minutes, William found it. There, buried among countless records of charitable donations, was a series of financial transactions. Large sums of money had been funneled through various accounts, many of which were linked to shell companies and offshore accounts. But there was one name that appeared repeatedly: J. Mitchell Harper, the founder and CEO of the Larkspur Foundation. Margaret's blood ran cold. Harper wasn't just a philanthropist, he was the mastermind behind a criminal empire that spanned the globe. And David, in his search for truth, had somehow stumbled upon this web of deceit. "This is it," William said, his voice low. "Harper's the key. He's the one pulling the strings." Just as they began to gather the most incriminating files, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Someone's coming," Margaret whispered, panic rising in her throat. William grabbed the files they had found and shoved them into his bag. "We need to get out of here, now." They made their way back to the exit, hearts racing. But as they neared the door, the sound of approaching voices grew louder. They had no choice but to split up. William motioned for Margaret to take a side exit while he created a diversion. As Margaret slipped out the back door, her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know if William would make it out, but she couldn't wait. She had to get the files to safety. The moment she reached the street, she ducked into an alley, breathing heavily, her mind spinning. She looked down at the files in her hands, knowing that these documents could expose everything, the full extent of Larkspur's corruption and David's connection to it. She had what she needed. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she realized that the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead of her, getting the evidence into the right hands. They had to make sure this information didn't disappear the way everything else had. Margaret's heart was still racing as she made her way to the safety of a nearby parking garage, clutching the bag that held the Foundation's dark secrets. William had promised to meet her, but she wasn't sure when, if ever, he would arrive. The weight of what they had uncovered was heavy on her mind. She was closer than ever to finding her son, but the forces working against her were more powerful than she had ever imagined. Larkspur wasn't just a charity. It was a machine one that could destroy anyone who stood in its way. But Margaret was no longer afraid. She had the evidence, and she wasn't backing down. She would find David, no matter what it took. Margaret sat in the dimly lit parking garage. The files spread out on the hood of her car, heart pounding, as she carefully reviewed the contents. The documents were overwhelming: multiple shell companies, falsified donation records, secret meetings, and large suspicious transactions. The name J. Mitchell Harper was everywhere, his fingerprints on every illegal deal. Yet amid all the chaos, one detail stood out: a specific set of dates, each marked with a red circle. Dates when David had been in direct communication with the Foundation, the same time when Lily Grayson had vanished. She knew she was running out of time. If Harper found out what they had uncovered, there would be no stopping him. The Foundation's power was vast, and their reach was long. A sudden knock on the window startled her. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She glanced up to find William, looking disheveled but alive. "I thought they had you," she whispered, relief flooding through her. "I almost didn't make it out," William replied, glancing around nervously. "But I managed to slip past security. We have to move fast. Harper's people will be looking for us by morning." Margaret nodded quickly, gathering the files and sliding them into her bag. "We need to get these to the authorities before they have a chance to destroy everything." But William was shaking his head. "No, it's not that simple. Harper's influence goes deep. Who can you trust? We need to take this to someone who can fight back." Margaret frowned, considering the options. There was no one left who could help her. Not the police, not the local reporters who had been too afraid of the Foundation's power. Then it hit her. "There's one person," she said, her voice steady now. "A journalist, someone who's been investigating Harper for years. If anyone can expose this, it's him." The journalist's name was Eric Lawson, a seasoned investigative reporter who had been blacklisted by several major news outlets for his controversial stories on corrupt corporations. But he wasn't easily intimidated. Margaret and William arranged to meet him in a secluded cafe outside of Seattle, far enough away from Larkspur's reach to avoid being tracked. They arrived early, scanning the area for any signs of trouble before slipping inside. Eric was already sitting at a corner table, a laptop open in front of him. He was a tall man, older than Margaret had expected, with a face weathered by years of chasing dangerous stories. "Margaret, William," he greeted them, standing up to shake their hands. "I've been waiting for you." Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid the bag with the Foundation's files across the table to Eric. "This is everything. The proof you need to bring down Larkspur." Eric's fingers hovered over the bag, then slowly opened it. He began flipping through the files, his eyes scanning quickly. After a few tense moments, he looked up. "This is big," he said quietly, his voice a mix of awe and caution. "Harper's empire, it's more extensive than I thought. I can't take this on alone. We'll need to go public, but it has to be the right time. If we move too fast, we risk everything." Margaret met his gaze, determination set in her eyes. "We don't have time. Harper's already covered his tracks. The longer we wait, the more people will disappear. Eric nodded grimly. Then we do it now. But you have to be prepared, Margaret. Once this goes public, there's no turning back. They'll come for us. By dawn, they had a plan. Eric would take the files to a trusted editor who owed him a favor. They would vet the information, cross-check the facts, and publish the story by the end of the week. It was a calculated risk, but it was the only chance they had. As they left the cafe, Margaret's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "We know what you found. It won't end like you think." Her stomach dropped. This was no longer just about exposing a corrupt foundation. It was about survival. "We need to go now," she said, her voice urgent. "Harper knows." William's jaw tightened. "We'll make it through this, Margaret, but we have to stick together." As the three of them parted ways, Margaret's mind raced. She had the evidence. She had the support of the one person who could make the world listen. But even as she felt the weight of her actions, she couldn't shake the feeling that Harper was always one step ahead. The storm was coming, and it would be a battle like none they had fought before.